Just last week, NVIDIA dropped the RTX 5090, the most powerful graphics card in the world, donning the new Blackwell architecture. But arguably, along with being super powerful, means that it has a super price tag to match that is simply beyond the remit of most consumers wanting the latest technologies and the highest frame rates in games. So now, with the review embargo lifting for its little brother, the RTX 5080, coming in at a much more palatable $999, can we get performance that gives us enough of a generational uplift over the 40 series while reining in on the value for money perspective? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Okay, so let's gloss over the packaging because it's something that's definitely important to consumers, especially when we think about added extras and goodies that come with a GPU. But, sorry to disappoint, it's exactly the same as the RTX 5090 founders, which we did an unboxing on a little over a week ago. That's not to say that it's bad, more than just if you've already seen it, then there's nothing new here. Well, I say nothing new. Inside, you do get a 12V 2x6 adapter, which takes it from 3 PCI Express connectors all the way up to the 12V 2x6. So slightly different from the 5090, which obviously came with 4 PCI Express 8 connectors. Beyond that, the packaging is the same, but obviously says 5080 embossed into the front. And you'll be pleased to know, if you've seen my unboxing of the 5090, that I finally figured out how to open the box now. So yeah, go me. Beyond the packaging, we have the card itself, and from a first glance, it looks, well, identical to the RTX 5090, but there is a small difference, and I'm not just talking about how it says RTX 5080 on it now instead of 5090, but it's actually a slightly different shade of colour, which in all honesty, I prefer the colour of the bigger brother, but I also wouldn't be willing to drop double the price on it just for aesthetic reasons. Though, of course, you get what is arguably a lot more power, though we will see what that means when we look at benchmarks shortly. Due to that being the only real difference between the two, we still have a dual slot card, which you could claim is easier to cool on a less powerful GPU, though they've still kept the dimensions the same at 304mm in length and 137mm in width. So there's still a lot of surface area to help spread the heat to dissipate. Now, much like the RTX 5090, NVIDIA with their founders model are relying on their fan pass-through cooling system to help push airflow through the heatsink fins and exhaust upwards, though there has been talk about what this actually means for CPU temperatures, and it's something we're definitely going to be looking at on both the 5080 and 5090 founders cards in the very near future, because well, a lot of outlets do test outside of a chassis, and I honestly believe that that could actually be a huge difference in terms of performance, especially in terms of 1% low figures, which we saw on the 5090 were, well, actually lower than expected. Now, in terms of branding, there's not really too much going on, short of just that really small NVIDIA logo once again, which I actually really like. I know who makes the GPU. I know what I've bought. I don't need reminded. So I'd like to give NVIDIA some brownie points on that one for just keeping it, well, nice and clean. Now, the card, like the 5090, has some understated LED lighting on the middle of the card and the GeForce RTX logo on the side, which sits next to the angled 12V 2x6 connector, though the 5080 has considerably less power of just 360 watts, which is just over 12% more than its predecessors, the RTX 4080 and 4080 Super, which both came in with a TGP of 320 watts. And due to this, NVIDIA do recommend an 850 watt power supply with 3 available PCI Express 8 connectors for the included adapter, or a single PCIe Gen 5 cable capable of supplying at least 450 watts of power. In terms of display outputs, just like the 5090, it packs a single HDMI and 3 DisplayPort connectors. And while I've seen comments on the 5090 review we did with consumers kind of upset that it only has a single HDMI, I'm personally okay with this, as DisplayPort 2.1b offers much more bandwidth over HDMI 2.1b, meaning higher resolutions and refresh rates are possible. So maybe that's a nod to, 8K gaming being possible in the near future. Probably not, but you never know. Now, the PCB on the Founders 5080 is still extremely small and is classed as I guess to some as a work of art and design engineering, especially when you factor in the GB203 400A1 GPU is packing 10,752 CUDA cores, which is an 11% uplift over the RTX 4080 and a smaller 5% increase over the 4080 Super. Other specs include the same uplift of texture mapping units, now at 336, the same for streaming multiprocessors, now at 84, along with the same for RT cores, and the same uplift for Tensor cores, which now come in at 336. For render output units, which are now at 128, we see 14% more when compared to both the RTX 4080 and Super variants, and both the L1 and L2 cache remain unchanged from the Ada Lovelace predecessors. Now, in terms of the GPU, we have a die size of 378mm squared, so similar to the 4080 series, and packs 45.6 billion transistors, which is actually less than both the 4080 and 4080 Super, which came in at 45.9 billion. Now, along with a bump from PCIe 4.0, we're now supporting PCI Express 5.0, and it's something we'll be having a look at in the near future to see if that's a limiting factor in terms of performance due to the bandwidth being double that of PCIe 4.0. Though, as we know, most modern GPUs, even high-end ones like the new Blackwell-based ones, rarely are able to saturate the bandwidth of PCI Express 4.0 in most gaming scenarios anyway, but we'll look at it in some later content regardless. Now, we're also pushing the memory, which, while we still have 16GB, we're now utilising GDDR7 on a 256-bit bus, which gives us 960GB a second of bandwidth, which is a step up from 716.8 on the 4080 and 736.3GB a second on the 4080 Super. So we have, I guess, somewhat strong uplifts in specs, but as we know, raw numbers like this don't exactly equate to raw performance. But with the 4080 Super launching at the same $999 price tag, and the 4080 non-Super coming in more expensive at $1,199, well, it's definitely an interesting talking point to see where performance fits in based on price. Now, speaking of performance, let's get into the reason that you're actually here, to see how the 5080 performs. To test, we used our GPU benchmark system with an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master motherboard. All testing was done on the latest version of Windows with the latest updates, and for our testing we used the NVIDIA 572.02 Game Ready driver. We'll mainly be comparing to the 4080 and 4080 Super to see what kind of generational uplift we see, and we'll be looking at 1440p and 4K today, but we will be uploading the 1080p results onto our Patreon if you want to check them out while also supporting the channel with everything that we do. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with a synthetic test and 3D Mark Timespy, and it's here where we see the RTX 5080 nestled in below the RTX 4090. In terms of uplift, we do find a 13% increase in performance over the RTX 4080 and 8% over the RTX 4080 Super, which now actually puts the 5080 above the 7900 XTX from AMD by 6%. So a good start in terms of standings, but not exactly groundbreaking compared to other cards. For our first game, we ran a Plague Tale Requiem, and at 1440p, the RTX 5080 comes in packing 18% more performance than the RTX 4080 and 13% more than the 4080 Super, which, while it doesn't sound huge, considering that the 4080 Super came in 20% more expensive, this is quite a big win, though it does only put it 12% ahead of AMD, which is currently retailing for $40 less at the moment. As we move up to 4K, there's not much change, with an 18% uplift over the RTX 4080 and 13% over the 4080 Super. And again, a similar but somewhat smaller uplift, now at 10% over the 7900 XTX. Now, one big point that I noticed is that the 5080 does sport better performance increases in the 1% lows than what we saw with the 5090, though this looks likely to be down to the driver, which we looked at just a few days ago, so who knows what future updates may bring. In Alan Wake 2, the RTX 5080 packs another 17% more performance over the RTX 4080 and 11% over the 4080 Super. These numbers are fairly good, especially when factoring in the relevant price points, but more impressive again is the 1% low figures that sees the 5080 ahead by 19% over the 4080 and 16% over the 4080 Super. This also means, due to the uplift, that we find the 5080 leading the 7900 XTX by 10% in the averages and 11% in the lows, but does still put it 14% behind the RTX 4090. As we move up to 4K, we see similar numbers with 18% more performance over the RTX 4080 in the averages and 13% more in the lows, while comparing to the 4080 Super, we see a smaller increase of 11% and 8% respectively. What this means for the competition is that NVIDIA now sits 13% ahead in the averages and 8% in the lows for a price point that matches, at least in terms of MSRP launch price, at the same $999 price tag. When looking at Baldur's Gate 3, we don't see as much of an increase with just a 15% rise in the averages, but we do see a drop of 7% in the lows when comparing to the RTX 4080. When we move up to the 4080 Super, the gains shrink, but still sees a 5080 packing 7% more performance overall. And again, the lows take a hit of 11%. Though a part of me really wants to blame it on the drivers, as we've seen with the 5090 suddenly finding extra performance by updating them. And I feel that the 5080 may be in a similar boat in places. This does also put the 5080 11% behind the RTX 4090 in the averages and only 8% ahead of AMD, though AMD really do come in much stronger in the lows. Moving up to 4K, and performance is where you'd expect it to be based on what we've seen so far, with a 19% lead over the RTX 4080 and 12% lead over the 4080 Super, and 7900 XTX, which came in with identical averages. Now, where things get really interesting is how our 4080 didn't do great in terms of the 1% lows, and because of that, the 5080 comes in with 39% more performance there, though retests could see this balance out a bit more. Now, we do, however, see a 14% lead in the lows over the 4080 Super and 20% over AMD, so there's definitely some strong performance coming from the new Blackwell GPU in this title. Though still not enough to get close to the 4090, as the 5080 comes in with 14% less performance in the averages and 10% less in the lows. In Black Myth Wukong at 1440p, and being honest with you, the results are weird, mainly on the 4080, as the 5080 comes in with 13% more performance in the averages, but a whopping 45% more in the lows. We did retest this over and over and over, but there's potentially a bug affecting the RTX 4080 specifically, as the 4080 Super didn't have the same problems, and instead the 5080 came in packing 10% more performance in the averages and 11% more in the lows. This also puts the new Blackwell-based GPU 19% ahead of AMD's best offering, with a 24% disparity in the lows too. And now it sees it only 9% behind NVIDIA's RTX 4090. Then at 4K, the uplift over the 4080 increases to 20% in the averages and a somewhat incredible 60% in the lows. Again, there's clearly an issue with that particular card in, well, this particular game, and could be for a multitude of reasons, of which we will investigate further as time goes on. That aside, we see 15% more performance over the 4080 Super in the averages and 12% more in the lows, while compared to AMD, we see 15% more performance on the 5080 in both the averages and the lows, which also puts it around the same level, just behind the RTX 4090. Counter-Strike 2 at 1440p clearly has a CPU bottleneck issue, and due to that, there really isn't much information to go off of, as cards are simply all over the place. The only data I feel that we could potentially discuss is over the 4080 Super, where we see 20% more performance on the 5080 averages, and 9% more in the lows. But even then, I'd be inclined to take these results at this resolution with a pinch of salt. As we move up to 4K, things balance out a lot better, though we don't see huge differences between each GPU, and instead see single-digit increases over the 4080 and 4080 Super of 2.5% and 2% respectively. What's more interesting here is how the 5080 takes a bit of a hit in the lows, and comes in with 10% less performance than our 4080, and 2% less than our 4080 Super. Though it is nice to see that the 5080 only falls 1% lower than the RTX 4090. But again, the lows do make it suffer a little. But it's enough to best AMD in the averages, but they fare extremely well in the lows in comparison. Moving over to Cyberpunk at 1440p, the uplifts are some of the strongest we've seen, with 23% more performance over the 4080 and 21% more over the 4080 Super. Due to the uplift that we've seen, we now bridge the gap to the 4090, which only comes in with 7% more performance, and this also means that we get 10% more frames over the 7900 XTX. In terms of the lows, these are also very impressive, with 27% more than the 4080, 23% more than the 4080 Super, and 1% more than the 4090, though AMD come in stronger on this one, putting the 5080 6% behind. As we move up to 4K, we continue to get strong performance from the 5080 that pushes past the 4080 by 23% in the averages, and 24% in the lows, with similarly strong performance over the 4080 Super of 20% and 24% respectively. This does also mean that we pack 7% more frames than AMD, though they still push ahead in the lows, putting the 5080 2% behind. But performance is strong enough to now only be sitting 8% behind the 4090, which is a card that retails for, in some cases, 3 times the MSRP cost of the 5080. Moving over to F124, and the increases in frame rates at 1440 aren't as strong as what we just saw. There's still some welcomed increases over 10% in both the averages and the lows over the 4080, and 6% and 5% respectively on the 4080 Super, but I think consumers are just expecting a little more. Though from our figures at 1440p, it's pretty clear to see that we are being held back by the rest of the system across all cards. Moving to 4K, the RTX 5080 showcases strong performance gains across the board. Compared to the RTX 4080, it delivers a substantial 20% improvement in the averages and then 16% in the lows. The gains over the 4080 Super are slightly more modest, but still significant, with 16% in the averages and 13% in the lows. However, when stacked against the RTX 4090, we do see a dip of 8% in both averages and lows. But for a card that's cheaper overall, I'm fine with this. Then, against the AMD 7900 XTX, the 5080 holds a solid lead with 10% better averages and then an 8% advantage in the lows, reaffirming its dominance at this resolution. In Fortnite at 1440p, the RTX 5080 delivers a mixed bag of results with notable gains in the averages, but it does struggle in the lows. Compared to the RTX 4080, it comes in 8% ahead in the averages, but does fall 6% behind in the lows, showing inconsistent performance in more demanding moments. Against the 4080 Super, the gap narrows slightly, though still leads by 5% in the averages, but lags by 9% in the lows. Then when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 trails by 7% in the averages and 8% in the lows, which isn't too bad considering the price disparity. For a similar price, there's the 7900 XTX, but here the 5080 leads by 21% in the averages, but essentially breaks even in the lows, with just a 0.3% difference, though 21% extra performance for the same price is pretty hard to ignore. At 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to show solid improvements over the last generation, but does only pull ahead of the RTX 4080 by 11% in both the averages and the lows, offering consistent gains, but I think consumers will maybe expect a little more. The margins remain the same against the 4080 Super, where the 5080 also leads by 11% in the averages and 10% in the lows. And when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 falls behind by 14% in the averages and 2% in the lows, which is actually a lot better than expected. Against the 7900 XTX, the 5080 comes out 29% ahead in both the averages and the lows, offering a compelling argument for gamers looking for balanced performance at this resolution without spending over $1,000. Though that is just the MSRP price, and retail price may actually be worse. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the performance at 1440p is a mixed bag. The RTX 5080 sees an 8% uplift in the averages and a modest 1% improvement in the lows over the RTX 4080, while the 4080 Super offers slightly smaller gains, where the 5080 comes in ahead by 5% in the averages and with no change in the lows. When compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 struggles to keep up, falling 14% behind in the averages, and it does suffer a sharp 26% drop in the lows. Though with such a big price disparity, that's not entirely unexpected. Meanwhile, the NVIDIA vs AMD battle heats up as the 5080 comes in 15% more powerful than the 7900 XTX in the averages and 5% better in the 1% lows. At 4K, the 5080 continues to deliver some small uplifts. Compared to the RTX 4080, it shows a 12% improvement in the averages, but struggles to make any big blows in the lows, falling 8% behind. The margin narrows slightly when compared to the 4080 Super, with the 5080 leading still, but only by 8% in the averages, and the gap increases as it sits behind by 12% in the lows. Against the RTX 4090, the 5080 faces an uphill battle, falling 6% behind in the averages and suffering a pretty steep 31% deficit in lows, further showing to us that there are some clear issues with 1% low performance, much like we saw on the RTX 5090. On the AMD front, the 5080 takes a crown with 26% more performance over the 7900 XTX in the averages, but due to its lackluster performance in the lows, it comes in evenly matched. In Starfield at 1440p, the RTX 5080 offers modest improvements over the previous generation, but fails to deliver any groundbreaking leaps. Compared to the RTX 4080, it provides a slight 5% gain in the averages, though it makes up ground with a 27.5% improvement on the lows, offering smoother gameplay and demanding moments. Against the 4080 Super, the 5080 edges ahead by just 2% in the averages, but maintains a stronger 34% lead in the lows. Then when stacked against the RTX 4090, the 5080 struggles, falling 16% behind in the averages and trailing by 1% in the lows, reaffirming the 4090's position as the dominant high-end card. Meanwhile, in the NVIDIA vs AMD battle, the 5080 outperforms the 7900 XTX with a modest 4% improvement in the averages and 5% in the lows, though the overall gains here feel underwhelming for what consumers might expect from this new release. But what's more interesting is how the 5080 now increases its performance in the lows, whereas other games, it actually suffered. At 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to show mixed performance, offering modest improvements over the previous generation. Compared to the RTX 4080, it delivers an 8% improvement in the averages and a stronger 23% boost in the lows, once again emphasising its ability to smooth out demanding moments in certain games. Against the 4080 Super, the 5080 inches ahead with a 2% lead in the averages and a more notable 17% gain in the lows. However, when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 struggles in the averages, again falling 16% behind, though it does manage to slightly outperform in the lows with a 1% lead, showcasing improved consistency in this title. In the NVIDIA vs AMD matchup, the 5080 edges out the 7900 XTX with an 8% lead in the averages and a 10% improvement in the lows, solidifying its position as a reliable option for gamers looking to balance performance and smooth gameplay. Interestingly, much like at 1440, the 5080 excels in the lows in Starfield, but overall averages will tell us more. Then lastly, in War Thunder at 1440p, it gives us a 13% uplift over the RTX 4080, while the move from the 4080 Super comes in much less at just 5%, though the 1% lows are much healthier on the new Blackwell-based GPU. This doesn't sound overly impressive, but I guess it does widen the gap over AMD, as the 5080 now widens the gap to sit at 26% ahead of AMD. So unless the red team can pull it out of the bag with the new RDNA 4 cards, it does seem like NVIDIA have the market pretty sewn up. At 4K, we see the 5080 coming in with 8% more performance than the RTX 4080 and a pretty measly 2% over the 4080 Super. Though again, the 1% lows do come in stronger with a 17% uplift, which does again widen that gap over AMD, though I think consumers may have just been expecting a little bit more. As we look at the overall averages, starting at 1080p, we see the 5080 sat pretty much exactly where we expected based on the rest of the charts that we looked at, sitting right below the 4090 but above the 4080 Super. This resolution has the tamest differences we saw as a result of the CPU bottleneck that we experienced, so we only see a 5% increase in performance over the last generation. But equally, it doesn't fall that far behind with only 3% less performance than the RTX 4090. So nothing too extraordinary here. But if you're buying a 5080, then realistically you aren't playing at 1080p anyway. Something a bit more realistic is 1440p, where we see some of the gaps start to widen somewhat, with the 5080 now sat 9% ahead of the 4080 and 4080 Super, which came in with an identical average FPS. Now, I do want to put a caveat on this, as the only reason they come in identically is due to Counter-Strike 2 running pretty abysmally on the 4080 Super, and therefore bringing both 4080 cards closer together again, though omitting this result would see more of a difference, but we're focusing on the 5080 here and not so much the 4080s. Now, the gaps do get wider on both sides of the card, however, and whilst we did see a bit of a boost with the older 80 series cards, we also see the 4090 taking a bigger lead ahead of the 5080, now with 9% more performance than the newer card. This and 4K is really where you're going to be playing with a card like this, so it's nice to see some slight improvements over the same tier of card from last generation, as I think gone are the days where a newer XX80 series would try to replace an older XX90 series. 4K is more than playable with an average frame rate of 163 FPS, which ends up being 9% higher than the 4080 Super, much like we saw at 1440p. While compared to the non-Super variant, the newer 5080 comes in around 12% ahead. Then, compared to the 4090, we see that the 5080 is outperformed by 11%, making this the biggest gap between the two that we've seen. For its pricing, the 5080 delivers solid results. It's not groundbreaking by all means, but still compares pretty well. Then, against AMD's RX 7900 XTX, which is priced similarly, the RTX 5080 shows a 16% lead in the average FPS, which is a notable win for NVIDIA. The lows do look a lot better in the overall averages, but I do still feel that while some games had strong 1% low performance, others still suffered, and this could see a lot change through driver refinements. Performance here is fine by all means, but I do feel that the card needs to mature a little and performance could increase as time goes on. In Port Royal, we see some notable performance gains over the previous generation, with the RTX 5080 scoring 18% higher than the RTX 4080 Super and delivering a 24% improvement over the non-Super variant. However, the 5080 still sits below the RTX 4090, trailing by 15%, which highlights the continued dominance of NVIDIA's flagship. Since this benchmark focuses on ray tracing, the results also reflect NVIDIA's advanced ray tracing technologies, which maintain a clear edge over the competition. That said, AMD's RX 7900 XTX performs surprisingly well, coming in just behind the RTX 4080. Despite this, the RTX 5080 outperforms the 7900 XTX by a substantial 37%, a result that gives us a strong indication of what's to expect in ray tracing performance during game testing. Overall though, the RTX 5080 showcases impressive progress, but this is only a synthetic test, and we really do need to see what that means in terms of ray tracing in games. Now, moving over to ray tracing and looking at Alan Wake 2 with ray tracing enabled at 1440p, the RTX 5080 showcases its strengths in handling demanding graphical features, but doesn't entirely dominate across the board. Compared to the RTX 4080, it delivers a solid 14% improvement in the averages and a 12% boost in the lows, offering a noticeable uplift in performance. Against the 4080 Super, the gains are more modest, with the 5080 coming in 5% ahead in the averages and 6% in the lows, showing only a slight advantage over this refresh card. However, when stacked against the RTX 4090, the 5080 falls short, trailing by 15% in the averages and 13% in the lows, reinforcing the 4090's position as the go-to for ray tracing workloads, though cost is obviously a big factor. The most striking comparison comes in on the NVIDIA versus AMD matchup, where the 5080 outshines the 7900 XTX by a staggering 70% in the averages and 62% in the lows, demonstrating just how far AMD still has to go in the ray tracing space. At 4K with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 5080 continues to deliver respectable improvements over the previous generation, but still shows some limitations. Compared to the RTX 4080, it offers a 13% improvement in the averages and an identical 13% boost in the lows, showcasing at least consistent gains. The 4080 Super sees smaller margins, with the 5080 coming in just over 3% ahead in the averages and 5% in the lows, indicating a narrower performance gap. Then, when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 still lags behind, trailing by 10% in the averages and a more pronounced 20% in the lows, which highlights its struggle to compete at the top end of the market, but considering it's a lot cheaper, this could be a game changer in terms of the cost per frame. When looking at how AMD do, the 5080 absolutely dominates the 7900 XTX, leading by a jaw-dropping 106% in the averages and 84% in the lows, making it pretty clear that AMD's ray tracing capabilities remain significantly behind NVIDIA's latest offerings. In Black Myth Wukong at 1440p with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 5080 showcases substantial gains over previous generation cards. Compared to the RTX 4080, it delivers a 20% improvement in the averages and an equally impressive 20% boost in the lows, offering a smoother and just more consistent experience overall. The margins narrow slightly against the 4080 Super, where the 5080 still comes out ahead with a 15% improvement in both the averages and the lows. However, the RTX 4090 still retains its high-end dominance, with the 5080 trailing by 10% in both the averages and the lows. The most striking result, however, is in the NVIDIA versus AMD comparison, and here the 5080 continues to utterly obliterate the 7900 XTX, boasting a staggering 233% lead in the averages and an even more incredible 307% improvement in the lows. This cements the 5080 as the clear winner for ray tracing in this title, especially at its given price point. At 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to deliver solid improvements over the previous generation. Compared to the RTX 4080, it offers a 24% boost in the averages and a 22% improvement in the lows, maintaining a strong lead. Then, against the 4080 Super, the margins are slightly smaller, with the 5080 ahead by 19% in the averages and 12% in the lows. While again, the RTX 4090 still remains competitive, at least in terms of performance, with the 5080 falling just 3% behind in the averages and 15% in the lows, showing that NVIDIA's flagship of last generation still holds its ground at 4K. Once again, the AMD matchup is striking, with the 5080 outpacing the 7900 XTX by an incredible 287% in the averages and an even larger 350% in the lows, further cementing NVIDIA's advantage in ray tracing performance, though who knows what the RDNA 4 lineup will hold. In Cyberpunk at 1440p with ray tracing enabled, the RTX 5080 shows respectable performance gains, but doesn't push the boundaries significantly. Compared to the RTX 4080, it achieves an 11% improvement in the averages and an 8% boost in the lows, providing a smoother experience in demanding scenes like what we tested. Against the 4080 Super, the performance difference narrows further, with the 5080 coming in just 4% ahead in the averages and 2.5% in the lows. Then, when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 lags behind by a pretty substantial makeup of 22% in the averages and 21% in the lows, which I feel some may be a little bit disappointed in. In the battle with the 7900 XTX, the 5080 pulls far ahead again, leading by 85% in the averages and 86% in the lows, so another win for NVIDIA. At 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to demonstrate its performance gains over the previous generation. Compared to the RTX 4080, it delivers an 18% improvement in the averages and a 17% boost in the lows, maintaining its strong advantage. Against the 4080 Super, the 5080 pulls ahead by 8% in the averages and 11% in the lows, showcasing a noticeable, if not groundbreaking, lead. However, when compared to the RTX 4090, the 5080 still trails by 24% in the averages and 22% in the lows, falling short of the Ada flagship's raw power. The 7900 XTX, on the other hand, lags well behind, with the 5080 outperforming it by 86% in the averages and 90% in the lows, providing a much more stable and enjoyable experience in this graphically demanding title. In F124 at 1440p, the RTX 5080 puts in strong performance, starting with a 17% improvement in the averages and an even more impressive 27% boost in the lows compared to the RTX 4080, highlighting smoother gameplay in critical moments. As we move to the 4080 Super, the gap narrows slightly, with the 5080 leading by 10% in the averages and 7% in the lows, still retaining a noticeable advantage. Though against the RTX 4090, the 5080 does fall behind by 15% in the averages, but it manages to come out ahead in the lows with a 10% improvement, offering a more consistent experience in some scenarios. And yes, we did retest this a couple of times. Finally, when facing off against the 7900 XTX, the 5080 solidifies its position with a 28% lead in the averages and a 14% advantage in the lows. Then at 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to deliver notable gains. Compared to the RTX 4080, it actually achieves a 21% improvement in the averages and an 18% boost in the lows, maintaining its lead as the better option for higher resolutions. Against the 4080 Super, the margins are smaller, with the 5080 ahead by 14% in the averages and just 5% in the lows, showing a bit of a diminishing but still present advantage. When stacked against the RTX 4090, the 5080 does fall behind by 18% in the averages and 12% in the lows, which, again, demonstrates that NVIDIA's former flagship can still hold strong in raw ray-tracing-based performance. Finally, when compared to the 7900 XTX, the 5080 comes out ahead once more with a 38% lead in the averages and a 23% advantage in the lows. In terms of the averages during ray tracing, when we look at the 1080p results, the RTX 5080 shows itself to be a strong contender, coming in just behind the RTX 4090 with an average FPS of 137. This places it 5% ahead of the RTX 4080 Super, which delivered 127 FPS on average, and 13% ahead of the standard RTX 4080 at 121 FPS. Now, compared to AMD's RX 7900 XTX, the gap is, well, even more noticeable, with the 5080 boasting a 56% advantage. This performance makes it clear that NVIDIA's architectural improvements are paying off in ray tracing heavy scenarios, even at lower resolutions. While the 1% lows are also solid at 101 FPS, the RTX 4090's consistent performance keeps it firmly ahead at this resolution. Then at 1440p, the RTX 5080 continues to shine with an average FPS of 98, placing it 7% ahead of the RTX 4080 Super and 17% ahead of the RTX 4080. While these gaps widen slightly compared to 1080p, the 5080 still trails the RTX 4090 by 19%, showing that the flagship card maintains a clear lead in this resolution. When compared to the RX 7900 XTX, the 5080's performance advantage shrinks somewhat, now sitting at 38%, but it's still a substantial lead that demonstrates NVIDIA's dominance in ray tracing workloads. Then the 1% lows remain consistent at 79 FPS, which does, again, ensure a smooth gameplay experience for demanding titles. Then, moving up to 4K, which is arguably the most important resolution for a card like this, the RTX 5080 manages an average FPS of 54, which, while playable in many cases, starts to push the limits of this card in ray tracing heavy games. It sits 7% ahead of the RTX 4080 Super at 49 FPS and 17% ahead of the standard RTX 4080 at 46 FPS, maintaining the same relative performance gap that we saw at 1440p. The RTX 4090, however, pulls even further ahead, delivering a 24% higher average FPS, but we do have to remind ourselves of the clear price disparity. Against the RX 7900 XTX, the 5080 remains dominant, outperforming it by 74%, so if ray tracing is what you're after, then there really is no other choice other than NVIDIA. The 1% lows drop to 44 FPS here, indicating that while performance is solid, the card may struggle in more demanding ray trace scenes. Now, just like our 5090 FE review, I wanted to take a look at upscaling. When we did on the 5090, we looked at Cyberpunk and Hogwarts Legacy. Well, for whatever reason, Hogwarts has decided to give us a massive headache in either not working or giving us completely different figures to what we had first time round. And not being keen on retesting 15 GPUs at 3 resolutions in both rasterization and ray tracing, we decided to ditch it. So instead, we'll be taking a look at upscaling and, more importantly, MFG in Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk, which are highly regarded as two of the best looking games you can currently play anyway. With Alan Wake 2, we weren't able to manually choose between different DLSS models, so our focus is on the performance improvements when enabling each level of upscaling. Starting with DLSS, which was set to balanced across all of our tests, the results were immediately impressive. The average FPS more than doubled compared to native rendering, with a substantial 102% increase. Latency also saw a noticeable reduction, dropping from 48.41 milliseconds at native to just 25.27 milliseconds, cutting it nearly in half. While that alone is a strong result, the real gains come from frame generation, which boosted performance by 210% over native, adding around 60 extra frames per second, though latency did creep back up slightly to 34.04 milliseconds. Building on this, enabling frame generation X3 pushed performance even higher, delivering a 320% increase compared to native rendering, which added another 60 FPS to the total, making it a noticeable difference, although latency continued to rise, landing at 37.35 milliseconds. Then, when we enabled frame generation X4, the gains were slightly smaller but still significant, with a 49 FPS jump over the previous setting, and this brought the total performance increase to an incredible 403% over native, with the frame rate landing just shy of 300 FPS, though latency did increase to 40.99 milliseconds. Even so, X4's latency remained lower than native, showing that the performance improvements come with minimal sacrifices in responsiveness. Turning on Raytracing provided similar trends, but with smaller overall performance gains compared to non-Raytrace settings. From native rendering, enabling DLSS delivered a 138% performance uplift, equivalent to a 36 frame per second improvement, while reducing latency from 100.97 milliseconds down to 45.41, which is a significant improvement. Adding frame generation made an even bigger difference, pushing performance up by 308% over native and adding another 80 FPS, though latency did climb a bit to 57.09 milliseconds. The jump from just DLSS to frame generation wasn't as dramatic, with an increase of 44 frames per second, and the trend continued with frame generation X3 and X4, where the final performance increase hit an astonishing 627% over native rendering. At this point, latency did rise to 63.36 milliseconds, but it still stayed well below the 100 milliseconds that we got with native rendering. The performance gains are impressive, but the way latency scales across these settings is equally worth noting. In both ray-traced and non-ray-traced scenarios, DLSS alone halved the latency compared to native, offering a substantial improvement in responsiveness. As we moved into multi-frame generation settings like X3 and X4, latency began to climb back up slightly, but even at its highest, it never exceeded native rendering levels. This demonstrates that while the advanced settings add complexity, they still manage to deliver both performance and responsiveness in a balanced manner. Overall, the upscaling and frame generation technologies in Alan Wake 2 provide more than just higher frame rates. They deliver smoother gameplay and improved latency, even under the most demanding settings. This showcases just how features like DLSS and frame generation X4 can redefine the gaming experience, ensuring better performance without sacrificing responsiveness. As we move on, Cyberpunk 2077 follows a similar trend to what we saw in Alan Wake 2, with each level of upscaling delivering improved performance and reduced latency compared to native rendering. Enabling DLSS on both the Transformer and CNN models provided substantial gains, with latency nearly halved at the base DLSS setting, before climbing slightly with each level of frame generation. Interestingly, while Alan Wake 2 showed consistent performance scaling with advanced settings, Cyberpunk adds a bit of a twist. CNN consistently outperforms the Transformer model in both frame rate and latency, with around 6% more frames and slightly faster response times. This deviation highlights the potential focus of the Transformer model on better visuals rather than just raw performance, something that we'll explore further when comparing image quality. Nevertheless, both models maintain the pattern that we've come to expect from NVIDIA's upscaling technologies, delivering massive performance gains across all settings, all while keeping latency improvements below native rendering. The choice here ultimately comes down to whether gamers prioritize responsiveness or visual fidelity, but the underlying trend aligns closely with what we observed in Alan Wake 2. With ray tracing enabled, Cyberpunk 2077 shows the same consistent trend that we've seen before, with each upscaling and frame generation setting delivering higher frame rates and gradually increasing latency. The CNN model continues to outperform the Transformer model, offering both better frame rates and lower latency, likely due to its focus on raw performance over visual enhancements. Regardless of the model used, the gains are substantial. DLSS alone cuts latency by more than half compared to native rendering, and each frame generation level pushes performance significantly higher. Whether you prioritise the responsiveness of CNN or the potential visual fidelity of the Transformer model, enabling upscaling provides a massive boost, ensuring a smoother experience even with ray tracing turned on. Then, taking it one step further, path tracing in Cyberpunk, it shows a significant uplift across all upscaling and frame gen settings, making an otherwise unplayable experience viable. Interestingly, while the CNN model generally performs well in terms of latency, the Transformer model pulls ahead in overall performance at the highest settings. For example, DLSS CNN cuts latency dramatically from 153 milliseconds at native to 51.98, while boosting performance by 300%. However, at frame generation X4, the transformer model delivers the best result, achieving 132 frames per second compared to CNN's 128, with slightly lower latency at 69 milliseconds versus CNN's 71. This highlights how the transformer model can balance higher performance with improved latency, particularly at the top settings, while CNN maintains a strong showing overall. Regardless of the chosen model, the impact of upscaling on path tracing performance can end up turning Cyberpunk into a playable and visually stunning experience. We also wanted to show visuals because numbers with latency are one thing, but side-by-side comparisons are always going to be a key point because no one wants super high performance if it results in the game looking like garbage. And we'll be doing some more content on that in a lot more titles, comparing performance and visuals very soon. For the visuals in Alan Wake 2, we see at native the game is expectedly amazing looking, and when we enable upscaling we see some loss of quality, with things being just a little more fuzzy looking, and with a little more noise, but nothing too bad and definitely nothing that you'll notice when gaming. When we enable multi-frame gen, we really don't see anything that stands out visually, and I wasn't able to pick up on anything out of place or any artifacts, so all in all, this is a pretty good way of playing the game. With ray tracing turned on, we don't see too much changing, but it does provide a more realistic look. This is probably because ray tracing is kind of always enabled in Alan Wake, and the ray tracing settings are more about path tracing. So that's expected, as we aren't getting the same sort of jump in visuals as we would going from no ray tracing at all to ray tracing enabled. When we enable upscaling, we don't really see much difference at all, and almost nothing is noticeable visually. This is mostly the case when we enable multi-frame Gen 2, but one very small difference, I guess, is that when the light flashes on the wall, we see the graffiti's reflection just flicker a bit. So it's really not a whole lot of obvious differences, and overall, I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice to make for much better frame rates. Moving over to Cyberpunk, and if you haven't seen any of our 5090 content, then you may want to check that out, as we already have gone over the visual differences between the different settings. So for the sake of brevity, I won't be going into as much detail here, and since we've learned that there really isn't any noticeable difference in quality, so for this we'll just be comparing native to frame gen essentially. Comparing the game with multi-frame generation enabled doesn't really actually give that much of a visual difference, and in this scene in particular takes almost nothing away. You could argue that there is more noise, but it's so negligible that you can't really tell. But what if we compare the models though? Well, when we put our frame generation clips together, we see very few differences once again. But if you look closer, then you can find that the CNN model is a little bit less clear, with the most noticeable point being underneath the light where you can see the smoke has more visual noise on the older model, whereas the Transformer model provides a slightly clearer visual. Ray tracing then improves our visuals with better lighting and reflections as you'd expect, but it does add some visual noise. And when we take a look at how multi-frame generation affects things we can see, again, well, barely any difference. One very small thing that I noticed was that the reflection of the neon sign in the puddle had a very slight delay in its movement when compared to the idle camera movement and the sign on the wall. This was present without upscaling enabled, but it did get, I guess, a slight exaggeration with upscaling. Then, when we look at CNN, we do find that not much changes, but if you're paying close attention, you can see that it does introduce a more obvious noise into the visuals, albeit only slightly. Path tracing is last, and yet again, visuals are improved over ray tracing, even if it does vastly change the way that the scene looks. When we compare native to multi-frame gen, we see some minor differences, like we saw with the visual noise like before, but we also see the entire scene brighten up. And this scene takes place in a room that has no outside lighting, so it remains consistent throughout, meaning that this isn't a change in game time causing the sun to light up the room more. This is, well, a pretty interesting difference, and I'm not really sure why it happened, as we didn't see this kind of behaviour with the other tests, so the fact that it shows up with path tracing is a little bit odd. Then, when we look at CNN, we see that it once again only really introduces a bit of extra visual noise. So gaming performance and upscaling to one side, we always want to take a look at the cooler to see how that performs along with power requirements, as these figures play a pivotal part in picking which brand of GPU and which model. So we booted up F124 and stuck it on an hour-long loop to see how good or bad the Founders card actually is. It's here where the 5080 delivers solid thermal and power efficiency, maintaining a GPU temperature between 64 and 68 degrees Celsius, averaging at around 66. The GPU memory junction temperature follows closely, peaking at 67 degrees Celsius, and holds an average of 68 degrees C, indicating effective cooling performance overall. Performance-wise, the GPU clock hovers around 2700 MHz, while the memory clock remains locked in at 15001 MHz. GPU usage stays high, averaging 98%, with memory usage at a steady 86%, though during this test our fan speed remained quiet, fluctuating slightly but averaging just under 1500 RPM. For power consumption, it's pretty well managed, with the total board power ranging from 310 watts to 325 watts, which is where we expected things to be given its 360 watts max power rating. Now, before we dive into the cost per frame analysis, it's important to consider the context of MSRP pricing. While it provides a baseline for comparisons, real-world availability and market conditions often mean prices can fluctuate, sometimes significantly. That said, MSRP values are still a good reference point for understanding the relative value of different GPUs in NVIDIA's Blackwell lineup and beyond. Looking specifically at 1440p performance, the RTX 5080 comes in with an MSRP cost per frame of $3.98. This kind of positions it as one of the most efficient high-end cards in terms of value, outperforming the RTX 4080 Super, which comes in at $4.35 per frame, and even undercutting AMD's RX 7900 XTX at $4.44. This kind of shows that NVIDIA has managed to deliver a more competitive price-to-performance ratio for gamers who want strong performance without venturing into flagship territory. Compared to the RTX 5090, which comes in at $6.61 per frame, the 5080 is significantly more cost-effective, offering a 40% lower cost per frame while maintaining respectable performance levels. Even the RTX 4090 at $5.78 per frame, it just can't compete with the 5080's value, highlighting the 5080 as the card to choose for gamers who care about getting the most performance per dollar in NVIDIA's higher-tier GPUs. Ultimately, the RTX 5080 strikes an excellent balance between cost and performance at MSRP. While not the absolute cheapest in terms of cost per frame, it does offer an appealing option for gamers who want high-end capabilities without stepping up to the likes of the RTX 5090, or compromising on features with a, lower-tier card. Of course, MSRP is just part of the equation, and the real-world value of the RTX 5080 becomes even more interesting when we consider typical selling prices of other cards, which we will be looking at very soon. Before we do, looking at 4K performance, the RTX 5080 comes in with a cost per frame of $6.13. This again puts it in a really good position when compared to other cards, like the RTX 4080 Super at $6.67 per frame, and the RTX 4080 at $8.29 per frame. Even AMD's RX 7900 XTX priced at $7.08 per frame. It, falls behind the RTX 5080, which again shows that NVIDIA have managed to get things, right. When compared to NVIDIA's flagship RTX 5090, which comes in at $8.60 per frame, the 5080 offers a 29% reduction per frame. While the 5090 is undoubtedly the performance leader, the 5080 is far more efficient in delivering value for money, making it, a smarter choice for most gamers who don't want to stretch their budget to extreme levels. Even the RTX 4090, which costs $8.76 per frame, struggles to match the efficiency of the RTX 5080 in this context. But this is all about MSRP, and we all know that the 4090 in reality is, much more expensive. Speaking of reality, at 1440p in terms of actual selling price, the RTX 5080, as we know, comes in with a cost per frame of $3.98. The RTX 4080 and 4080 Super now lag behind at $6.90 and $6.96 per frame, respectively, showing just how much value the 5080 provides in NVIDIA's stack. Or, depending on how you look at it, how much the 4080 and 4080 Super don't, because of their, inflated retail pricing. The worst one is the flagship RTX 4090 from last generation, sitting at $10.12 per frame, which can't even come close to matching the 5080's price and efficiency, further cementing it as a standout option for high-performance 1440p gaming. Looking at AMD's offerings, the RX 7900 XTX priced at $4.26 per frame, and the RX 7900 XT at $3.52 per frame, it does provide some stiff competition. However, the 5080 narrows the gap significantly when it comes to performance. Ultimately, at the selling price, the RTX 5080 does look good at 1440p, but we don't know if retailers are going to try to profiteer from it and try and sell it for higher than MSRP from the get-go. When we move up to 4K, the RTX 5080 continues to hold its own in terms of value. The RTX 4080 Super and 4080 now fall short, priced at $10.68 and $10.96 per frame, respectively, showing that the 5080 is the far better value proposition for NVIDIA enthusiasts, especially if wanting the latest technology. The RTX 4090 unsurprisingly performs well, but at a staggering $15.33 per frame, it's just beyond what anyone should be paying anyway. For AMD, the competition is closer, as the RX 7900 XTX comes in at $6.79 per frame, while the RX 7900 XT offers slightly better value at $5.91 per frame. Both are strong contenders in the value space, but the 5080 bridges the gap when we factor in other elements not shown in this chart, like Raytracing and upscaling performance. Budget options like the RX 7900 GRE and RTX 4070 Super deliver the best cost per frame, coming in at $5.53 and $6.15 respectively. However, these cards are targeted at a completely different market segment and don't offer the same level of performance for 4K gaming, which is where the 5080 excels. And again, you won't get the benefits of the Blackwell architecture, including DLSS with multi-frame generation. So let's break this down, because the RTX 5080 sits in an interesting position within NVIDIA's Blackwell lineup. It's not the flagship 5090, but it's far from a mid-range option. Instead, it aims to deliver high-end gaming performance with fewer compromises and a much more palatable price point. While the 5090 is designed for enthusiasts and professionals looking for no-compromise performance, the 5080 caters to those who want a balance between cutting-edge features and a reasonable investment. Starting with rasterization, the RTX 5080 delivers a strong uplift over its predecessor, the RTX 4080. In many cases, we see a 10 to 15% performance increase, which is notable for this tier. However, as with other cards in the series, the 1% lows still feel like they need some attention. It's not to say that they're bad, they're perfectly acceptable for gaming, but they occasionally lag behind the card's average performance, which can create moments of inconsistency in demanding titles. This could likely be addressed through driver optimizations, which tend to smooth out over time, and this is where I think NVIDIA need to focus right now. Interestingly, while rasterization performance is solid, it's clear that NVIDIA is no longer focusing purely on this metric for generational improvements. Instead, they're looking to leverage new technologies like Raytracing and Upscaling to deliver meaningful performance gains and more immersive visuals. While there's still, let's say, room for improvement in rasterization alone, it's clear that NVIDIA sees the future of gaming as a blend of traditional rendering and newer technologies. And the RTX 5080 is a great example of this direction. Now, when it comes to ray tracing, this has been one of NVIDIA's major selling points for several generations now, and the RTX 5080 continues to push this technology forward. Compared to the RTX 4080, the 5080 handles ray tracing significantly better, offering smoother gameplay and higher frame rates in titles that use advanced lighting, shadows, reflections, and, of course, global illumination. What's particularly impressive is how the 5080 compares to AMD's offerings, with NVIDIA still leading the way in ray tracing workloads. The performance gap becomes even more evident at higher resolutions like 1440p and 4K, where the 5080 delivers playable frame rates even without upscaling. As games continue to adopt more ray tracing elements and developers aim for fully ray traced environments, the RTX 5080 shows that it's, ready for this shift. Its architecture is well suited for next-gen visuals, offering a blend of raw power and efficiency that ensures games not only look stunning, but of course, probably even more important, they run smoothly as well. That said, the future of ray tracing isn't just about making it playable. It's about creating fully immersive environments. Now, developers are moving towards real-time global illumination, reflection, shadows, and ambient occlusion being calculated simultaneously, which, it represents the next level of realism. The RTX 5080 may not achieve the same performance levels as the 5090 in these scenarios, but it handles them well enough to be a great option for those looking to enjoy cutting-edge graphics without jumping to the flagship model. And if it doesn't, that's where upscaling comes in. Upscaling and multi-frame generation on the RTX 5080 delivers impressive performance improvements, with significant gains over native rendering across all settings. These features not only boost frame rates dramatically, but also manage to maintain lower latency, even as more advanced settings are enabled. The balance between performance and responsiveness make these technologies a standout piece of tech, and, personally, it's something I'm keen to see progress as the hardware and software mature. Now, the RTX 5080 is clearly targeted at gamers and enthusiasts who want high-end performance without stepping into the extreme pricing and power requirements of the RTX 5090. It's a card that, thrives at 1440p and 4K gaming, offering a great mix of features, performance, and price. While it doesn't aim to be the king of the hill, it does provide a more, approachable option that still showcases much of what the Blackwell architecture can deliver, without going into 5090 territory. Unlike the 5090, the 5080 feels, less like a showcase of what's possible and more like a workhorse for gamers who want a reliable, high-performance GPU that can handle the demands of modern and next-gen games. It's not about pushing every boundary. It's about delivering a well-rounded experience that balances power, efficiency, and price. And I feel it's only going to get better as drivers and game optimizations come along and, with it, being, I guess, even easier for developers to incorporate upscaling and MFG into their games, we should actually start to see more and more titles adopt this latest technology, though 75 games at launch is still pretty impressive. So, wrapping things up, the RTX 5080 is a card that feels like it was designed with gamers in mind. It takes the strengths of the 5090, its cutting-edge features, improved architecture and raw power, and just puts it all into a product that's more accessible, while still delivering, I guess, a fantastic gaming experience. It may not have the absolute best performance in every category, but it doesn't need to. Instead, it strikes that balance that will, in my opinion, appeal to a wider audience, offering next-gen capabilities without the need for flagship pricing or hardware requirements. And as we saw from the cost per frame, it definitely does that. While it's not for everyone, the 5080 is a great example of NVIDIA's ability to scale its technologies across multiple tiers, ensuring that even non-flagship products deliver an impressive experience. It's a card that shows, I guess, what's possible when you balance innovation with practicality. And it's exciting to see kind of how it sets the tone for the rest of the Blackwell lineup. Because if I'm being completely honest with you, aside from the 5090 as its top dog, I'm actually more excited about the RTX 5070 and what that can deliver, especially given, again, its price point. Maybe in the near future, we'll do a re-review of this card as those all-important driver updates come in. But for now, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, you can help support everything that we do by joining the super special Patreon family. You'll get access to a whole host of benefits, including exclusive behind-the-scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, meetups at the eTeknix offices, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.